Hello, I'm going to spend a few minutes looking at the Kinco Servo Plus Tool and how to configure the drive as a velocity amplifier. So we're going to spend a few minutes looking at the Kinco Servo Plus Tool and how to set it up as a velocity amp. Now, I've already got a drive set up, a Kinco Servo drive and a Kinco Servo motor, and I've actually got it operational. Obviously, if you're not in that condition, then you probably want to look at my previous video on the basic setup of a Kinco Servo motor and servo drive using the push buttons, which gets you to that condition. Now, once you are in that condition, the next thing you're going to need is an RS-232 communications cable and a USB interface for it. And once you've got that, then you'll be able to go into the communications interface on the Kinco Servo tool and select the correct COM port and the correct baud rate and press open. Now, if you have a functioning system, then it will go green, which means that you actually established communications with the drive. If it goes red, then you haven't established communications with the drive and you will have to fault find what the problem is. But here we have a functioning interface. So let's look at the Kinco Servo tool itself and some of the features that we have here. So you can see here along the top we've got file, communications, driver, motors, tools and help. Now driver is where all the basic operations are done, okay, for the drive. Everything you need to do for the drive is here. If you're running in torque mode, velocity mode, position mode, it's all done here. And it's just how you select those different fields that determines which modes you're going to be operating in and how the functionality operates. So we'll come back to that in a minute. The motor is defined here in the motor settings. So this is your motor definition for the motor that you are using. Now, if you're using a Kinco Servo motor with a Kinco Servo drive, then you don't need to worry about this at all. This will automatically populate when the motor is plugged into the drive. So you don't need to worry about any of these settings. But it is worth just checking that the 2-digit value here is the same value as written on the side of the motor. If the two correspond, then they are synced together and you don't have to worry anymore. But if you're swapping motors out between drives, then sometimes it gets lost and you may need to check that they are set correctly. So it's always worth checking. Once the motor is configured, then we need to look at the different operations that this product can actually do. So, as I said, we're in the Kinco Servo Plus tool, and if we open the driver drop-down menu, we can see the first one is basic operation. Now, basic operation is used within all the modes that are available. Okay, this tells us we can see our status words, our control words if we're running with a field bus. We can see our actual position, our actual speeds. We can see the control modes that we're operating in. We can see our operations mode here. This determines the actual functionality of the device. So what does -4 mean? I don't know without looking, so let's have a look. Oh, it means pulse train mode. Okay, so we can actually select the mode here by clicking on there, and we can see that we've got speed control mode, torque control mode, position control mode, homing mode, interpolation mode, and CSP. CSP represents the mode we would use if we're using a field bus, like an EtherCAT interface for the device. Then we would be in mode 8. But we wanted to be in mode 3 for speed mode. As you can see, there's two different options here. There's -3 and 3. Now, -3 is instantaneous speed mode, and 3 is profiled speed mode. The difference being that the profiled speed mode has an acceleration and a deceleration related to it, whereas the instantaneous speed mode doesn't. So we'll select in this particular instance a speed control, just instantaneous, the -3 version we find. And we can see that that mode is now set. And we now need to actually configure the drive to run with that. You can see this operation buffer mode here, operation mode buffer here is set to 0. Well, we need to get that to show the -3 in order to run. So how do we do that? If we go back to the screens, we might want to look at some of the other screens available before we go that far. So let's have a quick look and see what else is here. We've got control loops, position loop, velocity loop, current loop. We've got a digital I/O. We probably would need some digital I/O, so we'll look at that. Now, when you set up a Kinco drive for the first time, the drive automatically configures some of the I/O to a certain unique pattern determined by which mode you're operating in. So if you're in velocity mode, it will set a certain pattern. If you're in torque mode, it will set a different pattern, and so on and so forth. So you can see here that it's associated enable with digital input 1, reset error with digital input 2, homing start with digital input 3. Now these are not set in stone. You can change them by using the chevron on the side here and selecting the different functionality you want. But we'll leave them at set as they are for now. And you can also see on the side here that you've got the simulate. So we don't actually have to have physical I/O in order to use the product. We can use the simulated I/O to test our functions before we actually hardwire our device using the actual real I/O. So for instance, if I want to enable the drive now, all I have to do is press the simulate button there, and the drive is now enabled. Let's go back to here. And you can see that we've got our control modes. So these are all our different control modes that we can use here. We've got our object dictionaries, scopes. Error display might be something we might need in the system. So the error display shows the actual error status of the drive. If everything is green, then that means there are no errors. If you do get an error, then you will see that one of these indicators will go red, and that will indicate the error and give you an idea of what the error is so that you can troubleshoot your particular application. Always useful to look at. You might need to look at the error history, which will show the previous errors that have occurred. You will probably need the init save reboot window. Okay, if you modify any parameters or modify the motor parameters, then you will need to save them. It doesn't automatically save those parameters, so you will need to save them into the drive, and you do that here with the save control parameters or save motor parameters. You can also reboot from here, so you can do a soft reboot. Instead of doing a physical hard reboot, you can just power cycle the drive from here. And you can also initiate control parameters, which is basically setting the drive back to factory default settings, which is useful in some instances. So what we need to do now is we need to run it in the velocity mode, as we've stated previously. Now there are a number of different velocity modes available within the product, 3 basically. The first is target speed mode, which basically just allows us to set a value and run at a given speed. We can use analog input as a velocity mode, and we can use digital inputs as a velocity mode. So let's look at 2 of those. I can't show the analog mode, but I can show the parameterization of the analog mode because I haven't actually got an analog input on this unit. But let's look at the basic modes of operation and see how we get on. So the first thing we need to do is enable the drive. When we enable the drive, we can see that this operations mode buffer is set to -3. That means now we are in velocity mode. Now, the first operations velocity mode that we can use is the target speed mode. So here you can see that the target speed is set to 0. If I set that to a value, 100 RPM in this case, then the motor will run at that given speed, and I can change that value. And the direction of operation by changing the sign of the input. So that's target speed mode. Target speed mode allows us to just get the system functional and make sure that everything we want is operational. It's a very, very quick and easy way to check the system out. If we want to use the analog input, then we will need the analog speed mode. Now there is a screen for this, and basically we are setting our analog input up with our dead bands and how the analog input functions in relation to the velocity that you want to use. Note that here we can select the analog input 1 or analog input 2 as our control input. Okay. But I'm afraid I can't show that here at this time because I haven't got an analog input. But you'll see that, for instance, we have 11.4 volts RPM per volt. So as we change our voltage, that's how much the analog input will vary the speed based on that value there. So I'll close that window. The other mode of operation that we could possibly use is DIN speed mode, and we can select that here using control mode, DIN speed mode. Now this basically allows us to configure a number of velocities. I'll just use the first input. Notice I didn't press enter. You need to press enter in order to define the value. So I've loaded in DIN speed 0 and DIN speed 1, which is associated with one digital input. The more digital inputs you have, then the more digital speeds you have, then the more digital inputs you will need to associate, because this is a binary selection. So once you've defined the inputs that you're going to use, the velocities you want, you need to define the inputs. So we would go into the spare I/O that I've got here, which is input 6 in this particular case, and I can select DIN vel index 0, press OK, and now I have associated that input with the DIN velocity modes that I've set. So if I now enable the drive, by changing that input, I can change between the two velocities that I've set. I can change that to 0, for instance. And now it just runs with the 1. Now, that's a very useful feature if you're using a PLC or a multi-switch input and you want to have multiple velocities in your application. That basically covers the operation of velocity mode. If you've got any questions or you want further information on the product, then please feel free to contact us. Thank you.